Good. Now we can start. So I think without further ado, we'll just begin the final session of day one of the conference. And I know folks will join us over the next few minutes, and that is fine. I am Leslie Dixon, and I'm a Master of Arts in Professional Communication student in the School of Communication and Culture at Royal Roads, and as also an independent communication consultant. And beside me on the screen is my MAPC colleague, Ben. Ben, do you want to introduce yourself, or do you want me to do it?
Totally. Sure. I'm a communications consultant as well. And I'm very excited to be here and to see Leslie. I haven't seen her face in summer. So I'm glad to see you, and excited to kick things off with you today.
Great. Do you want to do a land acknowledgement for yourself before I do one for the conference and for myself?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. So I'm happy to be calling in from Treaty 6 territory, the traditional lands of the Cree, the Saulteaux, Dene, Dakota, Nakota, and the homeland of the Métis. I myself am from Yellow Quill First Nation on Treaty 4 territory, but I call Treaty 6 territory Saskatoon, Saskatchewan home. Great.
Thanks, Ben. And so I have the privilege of being on the ancestral and unceded territories of the Coast Salish peoples, the Tsleil-Waututh, Squamish, and Musqueam nations in Vancouver, BC. And I also want to share, before I get into introducing our amazing speaker, that Ben and I have both finished all of our requirements for our masters. Yay, early. And so we're looking forward to convocation in June. And I think, Ben, you'll be there. I'll be there. Will you? I hope so. Okay, awesome. Sorry, we won't go back and forth as much with the audio. So it is my honor to introduce the speaker of the final session today, Dr. Taiwo Afolabi, who will be giving a presentation entitled Ethical Questioning and Socially Engaged Theater Processes and Procedures. He is a theater maker, a scholar, a theater manager, an entrepreneur focused on amplifying voices and experiences and recentering governance models, strategies, and systems that are on the margin through the lens of decolonization, equity, and anti-oppressive approaches. I confess I tried to condense his impressive bio and accomplishments, but as befitting a scholar whose focus is theater, Dr. Afolabi has many roles. He is the Canada Research Chair in Socially Engaged Theatre and the Director of the Centre for Socially Engaged Theatre at the University of Regina. So he's sort of a neighbor of Ben's. Dr. Afolabi is also a Senior Research Associate at the University of Johannesburg in South Africa and the Founding Director of Theatre Emissary International in Nigeria and Canada. Before I hand things off, a few housekeeping notes. This session will be about 45 minutes in length, and we hope to have time for questions at the end. So Dr. Afolabi will deliver his presentation, and please note in the chat any questions, and we'll hold questions until the end. So Ben and I will go off camera while Taiwo presents, but we'll be gathering questions that you pose throughout the discussion. And Ben will pose the questions to our speaker with my assistance as needed. And also a note that the mic and camera functionalities for the Zoom session are not enabled for conference attendees. So to ask questions of the speaker, please post them in the chat, and we have a process to log those so that we can ask those after the presentation is over. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome our conference participants to what promises to be a fascinating presentation. Dr. Afolabi, I will now turn things over to you.
Thank you so much, Leslie and Ben. Deeply appreciate the introduction. Thank you for the opportunity to be here. Thank you to the conference organizers. Do appreciate the privilege to be invited to speak. And thank you to everyone that is participating today here. You've been on this conference since a few hours ago, so I know that you've been taking in a lot. So thank you for staying for my presentation today. I'm dialing in from Regina. I'd like to acknowledge it's the homeland of the Anishinaabe, Dakota, Lakota, Nakota, and the homeland of the Mischief and Mischief Nations. And of course, it's on. I'm on. That's Treaty 4. But one of the things I try telling that I've been doing in the past few months, you know, it's really, when I have the opportunity to speak like this, I try to go back to TRC and just read one of the recommendations, and that decision came for me because I realized a lot of the time, particularly in my own world, and I'm having different conversations, meeting different people. It's not everyone that has taken the time to read TRC. So I've kind of taken it on my own practice to say, at least I'm going to read one item. So I will, if that's okay with everyone, I'm just going to read. If you have it with you, that's fine. I'm also going to read it out loud. I'm going to read from Media and Reconciliation, and I'm just going to read just 84. It's action item number 84, and I'm not going to read everything. I'm just going to read a few points there. We call upon the federal government to restore and increase funding to the CBC, Radio Canada, to enable Canada's national public broadcaster to support reconciliation and be properly reflective of the diverse cultures, languages, and perspectives of Aboriginal peoples, including but not limited to: 1, increasing Aboriginal programming, including Aboriginal language speakers; increasing equitable access for Aboriginal peoples to jobs, leadership positions, and professional development opportunities within the organization; continuing to provide dedicated news coverage and online public information resources on issues of concern to Aboriginal peoples and all Canadians, including the history and legacy of residential schools and the reconciliation process. I thought I should read that because, again, we're at a communication conference, and again, hopefully, you know, for those that have read the TRC to this point before, it's a reminder. But for those that are yet to get there, I'm also reading it afresh for everybody to hear that. My presentation today, and I'm going to share my screen here in a bit. Hopefully, you can all see that. Just give me a minute here, trying to just amplify my screen here. Can you all see that?
Yes, I'm confirming it's Leslie that I can see it. So I imagine everyone else can as well.
Great. The title of my presentation is Ethical Questioning and Socially Engaged Theater. I have been introduced, so I won't introduce myself further. Please, if you have any questions, just put it in the chat. To be happy to engage together. I've done my land acknowledgement, and like I said earlier on, it's for me, it's about what can I constantly, as a landed immigrant in Canada, originally from Nigeria, I'm asking myself, what can I, in what ways can my work, whether in the academia or in community, connect to that? And that's my offering today to read it here. See. In the few minutes that I have, I'm hoping that this presentation, I'd like to share ways ethical questioning, which I call EQ, can offer researchers and practitioners within diverse contexts, particularly research and community engagement, the opportunity to reflect before action, to reflect in action, and to reflect on actions. I attempt to highlight processes and procedures of engaging EQ through some socially engaged data projects in Canada and elsewhere. And I frame that within the lens of reflexivity, social justice, equity, and praxis. And ethical questioning really calls for a shift of ethics from a morality debate to a political debate. The reality is that theater is a means of communication, is in its art form. We're communicating, and the kind of work that I do is really working in community. And it go by different name: applied theater, theater for social change, social engaged theater, whatever the nomenclature. It goes by different nomenclatures. But But I'd like to focus on some of the one project that I did here in Canada recently, and it's still ongoing, and a project that I did in Burkina Faso some couple of years ago. So I'd like to start by telling you a story, and I'm going to read from my note here. I hope you can still all see my screen. Yeah? Great, okay. So over a decade ago, I was devising a drama skit during a community theater project when Mama, not a real name, of course, she was a project participant and a community elder, asked me through an interpreter, who owns this drama? She continued, after we finish this work and you leave, do you owe us for the knowledge you received from us? Or do we owe you for the skills you shared with us? I replied to her that the drama belongs to all of us, myself and the community. This means that we all own it and no one owes anybody. She asked the next sets of questions. If we all owe it, if we all own it, how do we share it? Who has control over it? And with whom does the work live? Which platform will house or host the work? I answered her that since the creation of the work is a collective effort, the community will make decisions relating to the work, both the process and the product. She continued, so can we get the report of this work and any other outcomes of this project in Yoruba language? The language spoken, that's the language spoken predominantly in West Africa, Nigeria. I replied to Mama that I couldn't guarantee this, particularly because that request would require a skill set that I do not necessarily have in a comfortable way for me to write it in that language, even though I speak the language. And I don't have the resource to outsource it, which was, again, that was not available. So Mama returned to the group that were devising, feeling satisfied that she had asked all of her questions. But that was the first time a community member would walk up to me and ask me such questions. Later on, her interpreter told me that Mama mentioned that she was not really interested in the idea of co-authoring or co-authorship because many researchers have promised them this before. Rather, she was interested in two things. One is the control and the sharing of the knowledge generated from the research. That this is important to her because her community would like the work shared only in their community without necessarily disseminating it to the world. Though confrontational, Mama's question added to the seed of ethics germinating in me as a practitioner from theater for development background. This time it was not about an act, like the product, devising and all that, but the entire research process and what happens to both the process and the product afterwards. Her question centered on knowledge mobilization, as we'll call it in the world of research. But to broaden the impact of our questions, she was concerned about treating knowledge as a shared resource to be freely used by all stakeholders, who we consider as co-owners. She was posing a cooperative model in sharing knowledge as a resource. So apart from my experience in theater for development, my interaction with Mama was another experience that raised my consciousness and sensitivity around ethics. Mama's interpreter further shared with me that the community distrusts researchers because there has been experiences in the past involving practitioners, both locally and internationally, who extracted and never looked back. Although Mama confessed she did not really understand how it works, her children told her that many researchers abroad capitalize on the information from the community and package it into knowledge, which can help universities access more funding and advance the researcher's career. I was shocked when Mama told me that through her interpreter. I later learned that Mama had children living in the global north who visited her a lot and encouraged her to boldly ask these questions. Later on, I was told that Mama had visited her children in some countries in Europe and in North America. The idea of questioning. Questioning is an art, according to Postman in 1979. The art and the act of questioning are foundational to human existence. In fact, we start expressing questions the moment we could talk. It is a bedrock upon which many curiosities rest. Any meaningful line of inquiry starts with questioning, whether questioning oneself or questioning the other. In fact, there are times that one can perceive someone asking questions, whether with their gesture or with their facial expression. Particularly when you're interacting with a 1-year-old, a 2-year-old, it's like they're asking questions, even though they can't say anything. But you're like, I wish I can know what's going on in their mind. Understanding the importance of an inquiry-based perspective, my parents would say, inquire the way from the one who knows, and you will find it, provided you're a deep listener. The quality of a question may even impact the quality of the response. For instance, we now know that open-ended questions in many ways can offer the opportunity for nuanced and critical perspectives and open up the door to endless possibilities. In Plato's words, the right question is usually more important than the right answer. As water is to life, so is questioning to research. It is the lifeline of any meaningful research and resides at the core of any systematic and creative investigation. As communicators, questioning is central to our art. The research question and the process of questioning help clearly define a path for the research process, because a research question is usually the first step in any research project. Researchers, in fact, are trained to carefully query and insightfully craft questions that can evoke responses to experiences, practices, processes, people, and even, of course, in understanding the planet. This means that question is critical to developing and executing research. The weightier the question, the deeper and richer the potential findings. So the subject of questioning can open the space to dialogue around research, methods, community-based research, service, and of course, research ethics itself. Furthermore, many of the communities, particularly equity-owned communities, continue to feed the academic machine of research without necessarily seeing any dividend for their communities. Generations of researchers, systems, and processes subject many communities to objects that need to be consider many of these communities as objects that need to be researched. And the knowledge from such communities can be used against and has been used against such communities on many occasions. It seems this is a deliberate setup, and this is what Michel Foucault calls subjugated knowledges to build the dominant epistemes, colonial and capitalist epistemes, that is largely responsible for the current world crisis. So accessing what is called subjective knowledges, that is not considered serious, unserious ways of knowing that dominant cultures neglect, exclude, represses, and even at times simply fails to recognize. And this is what Dwight Conquer Goods talked about in 2002 in his work. Because this local know-how or grounded knowledge is not necessarily subjugated again. Rather, the Western regimes of knowledge is finding ways to extract and at times even co-opt the subjugated knowledge into the messy system. The episteme violence, as Dwight Conquer Good mentioned it, is the whole realm of complex, finely nuanced meaning that is embodied, tacit, intuned, gestured, improvised, co-experienced, clever, and all the more deeply meaningful
because of its refusal to be spelled out. This is the realm where socially engaged theater dwells, an affect-driven, artistic, expressive form that uses the power of drama and performance to achieve its purpose. So socially engaged theater as an affect-driven aesthetics, a community-based, driven by community, and mostly improvisational or devised in nature, in its quest to address social issues, opens up room rather for ethical considerations that need to be carefully considered. So working with the community, as in the case of social engaged theater, creates ethical contours, dilemmas, and realities, whether intended or unintended, that require constant negotiation. So in navigating such ethical concerns, there has to be a recognition of the havoc caused by researchers in the past and practitioners in the past in the name of community good. For instance, in recent times, researchers' moves or gestures are receiving intense scrutiny by the community because of the level of mistrust from the community's prior experience. I'd like to note here that writing ethics is different from doing ethics. As a researcher who's had the privilege to work in over a dozen countries across 4 continents, the question around ethics becomes critical, like the story that I started with. Whether I am asked those questions, or even before I am asked those questions, that I want to ask myself some questions before questions from community start coming my way. So beyond research, questions and questioning, therefore, are essential to any meaningful change. Change first at the personal level, to the systemic level, and even to the societal level, requires authentic and rich questions that grab people's attention, that engage critical thinking capacity, that provoke our consciousness and drive a desired action or change. So such right questions can traverse the personal into political and into the systemic. This exploration took me to my next slide, where I'm going to be talking about ethical questioning. It is therefore in this whole idea of going into community, speaking and engaging and devising and working with and alongside them, whether I come in as a parachute, and I'm going to talk about that later, parachute practitioner, or whether I stay with them or work with them, or I live there, that is idea of questioning and ethical questioning comes into play. Ethical questioning is the process of asking practice-oriented and critical questions that have ethical implications in order to better understand or challenge the system one is working in. Questioning has been considered as a democratic skill. In his foreword to Nora Morgan and Julian Saxon's book, John Otto writes, "Effective questioning is the key to responsible, active, resourceful, democratic citizenship." So the ability and the courage to ask questions lie at the core of the democratic process. Questions happen at different levels, from thinking to remembering to understanding, solving, reasoning, creating, and judging. And all of that is coming out of the work of Morgan and Saxon, 2006. There are questions that even draw upon our knowledge, test comprehensions, require application, encourage analysis, invite synthesis, and promote evaluation. There are also questions that relate to our feelings, how we feel, the affect. So from the thinking to the feeling. Such questions aim to unveil someone's interest and support the process of engaging, committing to, internalizing, interpreting, and of course, evaluating. So this process of questioning, bringing that within the context of ethics, the goal of ethical questioning, therefore, of asking, question making and question asking, is not about learning how to ask questions. We all know how to do that right from when we can talk, but the goal is to become an effective questioner, which can be hard because it takes patience, diligence, vulnerability, and trust. Ethical questioning recognizes the need for productive questions in question making and question asking. It is because writing ethics, therefore, is different from doing ethics. And for those that are in the academia, just an anecdote here, we do a lot of writing ethics. We write ethics application, we submit it and all of that. But really, the ethics board are not following us to the community. It totally boils down to the researcher to ensure that they actually do things ethically. Based on this understanding of what ethical questioning attempt to do, I've sort of built it on this triad of reflexivity, social justice, and praxis. And for the sake of our time, I'm not going to go into detail of that. But what I want to focus on, because I'm going to use that as the basis to go into my next aspect of my presentation, where I'm going to just looking at 2 case studies upon which I'm building, which I'm going to be using. I'm going to be talking about in the next few minutes. So building these on reflexivity and praxis and social justice, and then bringing that into starting first with our positionality starting with the self, moving on to what I call collective individuals. And by that, I mean the other, whether singular other as a person or as an entity, as an organization, but the collective individuals beyond just one person. And then bringing in the idea of reciprocity into that, the questions that I'm asking myself, can I lend that to other people? And again, and that's why I started with the example of Mama asking me those questions. And Mama did say that because she's been part of different projects over the years, she's asked herself those questions, and that's why she was able to actually, come up and ask me those questions. Although very confrontational, but really those were part of those just tipping point of epiphany for me each time I remember that. A lot of the time, as action researchers or practitioners, participatory action researchers, or researchers working in community or practitioners working in community, we are taught to think about action, reflection in action, and reflection on action. And this is where I'm going to be dwelling on in the next 20 minutes or so. A lot of the time, we don't talk about reflection before action. So what I want to do is based on reflexivity, and the idea of reflexivity is really picking up, again, those questions as practice oriented from the lens of equity. What does that mean when I'm going to a community? What are the questions I need to think about before, during, and of course, after? So it's built on this triad of reflection before, reflection on, and reflection in action, and then of course, reflection on action. The first thing first is always to start with my positionality. And I'm using myself, the 2 projects I'm going to be talking about as a case study here. Positionality as a researcher, it is not just about who I am or the lens I'm engaging with, but I'm really considering the multiple identities and hearts and realities that I hold, the multiple communities that I connect with. And I'm considering the sociocultural, economic, and political context that creates my identity as a person, as a father, as a partner, as a teacher, as a researcher, whatever we want to put into that space. But beyond that, my positionality even within my organization. I also want to investigate the positionality, the positions of others, and really questioning what does that mean, particularly for individuals, and of course for institutions. And for socially engaged theater, a lot of the times we work with so many communities, non-for-profit. There are times you have funders and all that. We need to start thinking about systems and structures, and of course the context of that work. And then really thinking about all of that within the context of social justice, within the context of not causing harm within the context of social good, and all of those things becomes very important through questioning. So I'd like to start. One of the projects that I'm working on right now is called Caribou Project. I was invited into that project by the Ugandan Canadian Association Association in Saskatchewan. It's called Caribou Project. It's really a theater artistic project that is geared towards offering immigrant Africans the opportunity to really express themselves and speak about their immigrant experience. In the name of the organization, I know is Ugandan, but the mandate is beyond Uganda. It's really bringing a lot of African immigrants in Regina together to create space for that. And so I was invited into that project in 2011 when I got to Regina, at the beginning of that, because that project has been ongoing, they started it before I came here, and they invited me into it. The first thing I did alongside the director of the organization and who invited me into that is to sit down and just say, hey, what are the baggage I'm bringing here? What are the baggages the person we're all bringing to the table here? Even though there is no ethics application, there is no board review, nobody is writing and approving any ethics or anything, no. But the process of sitting down, because it wasn't a research of a university, no, it was a community work. The process of before action was so critical that even before we started asking ourselves the question around what's my position? What am I bringing to the table? As someone that is coming from the academic community, what does that even mean? What does that mean for an immigrant, who is interested in having the conversation about their experience in Canada? And so the first action around questioning our socio-political, economic, cultural nuances that we bring to the table was critical. The second thing we did was to really look at what kind of agreement do we need to enter into here, particularly because some of the questions, some of the stories that may be shared at that point, we didn't even know what was going to be shared. They may be very sensitive. What was the objective? What was told the funders? Because we had funding, obviously. And so we're really asking ourselves those kind of questions in a practical sense, because a lot of the time, the before action, why it's important is that before we, at the level of conceptualizing the project, at the level of thinking about it, inviting people into it, having those expectations, having those sort of objectives, those guiding principles were very critical. And so when we got into action, the project started, and it was, we had over a month of bringing community members together. We did a lot of talks around racism, around anti-racism, and different kind of exploration, workshops and all that. What that helped us to do was that right from the beginning, we baked into that even our evaluation that we had to consider post on reflection, on action. So the idea of the before action was so important that right now, if I want to do any project, I'm not going to even get onto that project without tackling before the action first. And the reason why I'm saying that is that right now, any action in our community, in any community right now, is under huge level of scrutiny, particularly if it's in equity-owned communities. And I think I've talked about that earlier in my presentation about why that is. But beyond the fact that it's under high level of scrutiny, is that I'm also telling myself that I think I'm really at that point where I want to be more intentional. It wasn't as if I wasn't intentional before, but I really want to ask myself, does it even worth doing at all? Particularly the kind of work that I do is always in community, and whether I'm asked or I conceive the idea myself and all that. I really want to contribute in a meaningful way. Before I even talk about activities or anything, I want to have those clear lines. And then even at times it might involve me, having a conversation with my founder to say, these are the questions that are guiding the process. And so that was the first thing that we did on that before action. During action, that's when we now, of course, we did all the planning, what that looks like, scheduling and all that. But then during the action, that's when we were at every contact, every point in time, we're going back to check the content. We're going back to check the creative process. We're going back to check our methodology. We're devising. We use a lot of writing. The whole idea was for a lot of the participants to be able to write their work by themselves. They wrote monologues. They performed it. We're always going back. For me, it was important for us to pause, to take a pause. Because we're then checking in the room, in what ways is me as the practitioner here coming to this space, in what ways am I silencing other people? Those questions that Mama asked me were some of the questions that I had to consider in terms of guiding the process of my own interaction and relationship with the community. We did the devising, and I'm not showing pictures, I'm not showing videos because I don't have the permission to show that, and that's because the project is still ongoing, but I have the permission to share about the project. And also for me, part of my own ethical process is that I'm very intentional about the kind of, I don't want to contribute to some narratives, particularly when it comes to what is shown and what is not shown. So I hope you permit me that I'm talking through it. Hopefully my storytelling would give a clear idea of what the project is about. And so ultimately, what that did help us to do was some couple of things. One was to help us to understand the level of care, because when we talk about ethics of care, we talked about care, care within the context of ethics. We're talking about relationality. We're talking about the process of taking care of and giving care. And we're really thinking carefully about what does that mean within the context of bringing different people together. It was an intergenerational project. What does that mean for this community? Secondly, it's also the idea of the critique of not just only the system, but even our own experience, right? And working with immigrant communities, there are a lot of experiences that we've had and that we continue to have, that we think about them all the time, whether good, whether bad, whether it's just there. And so having those series of conversations, whether through workshops or at the end, we just ask everybody, check in to how everybody's doing, or before we even start anything, what are we going to do today? How was the last workshop? How did it go? Each person writing their own narrative, checking in to know, are there any triggers? Are there anything you want to talk about? Do we have space are there resources that we need to provide and things like that? We're doing all of that during action, right? And then ultimately, evaluation, which is, after action, was that when we finished shooting everything, because of COVID, we couldn't perform together in person and all that. We had to shoot differently and work around that schedule. What that did help us to now come to the table is to now say, this project, did it really work for the community? And if it worked for the community, what does that mean for the future of that project or for the future of the work? So that's with the Caribou project, that's how we engage before action, in action, and in action, which is during action, and of course, after action. The second project I'd like to quickly highlight, and I've kind of talked about this before in my in some other presentations. It was a project that I did some couple of years ago in Burkina Faso. I think it was 2012, 2012. Burkina Faso is in West Africa, and they speak French. My French is not that good. And so I was invited as a parachute practitioner. We've heard parachute researchers, parachute scholars. For me, I was a parachute practitioner because it was hit and run, right? I came in and then spent, I think, some couple of days, weeks, and then I left. When I got into that community, the first thing I did was to do what I called, train the trainer. When I got in, I was assigned an interpreter who worked with me and another practitioner to work alongside me there. So the first day was essentially really walking through, the entire content which I developed. But what was and then the second step, I met with key stakeholders from their mayor to their counselor, rather, to the teachers, and then finally with the kids in the secondary school that I worked with. But what was interesting for me, was eye-opening for me, was that when I got into the space, I realized that those kids were connecting more with those two people, the interpreter and the practitioner that was connected with me. And so after the first day, going back to my heart of my reflection in action and on action, now I came back and I told myself, I kind of took a check in the room and realized that these kids were connecting more to those people than me. So I asked my two colleagues that were working with me, I said, for the next day, is it okay if you take the lead? All right, I know that I'm the lead, facilitator here and all that, and I came in to do this and all that, but this is what I observed. And of course there was that initial, hesitation and all that, but we sat down and I said, well, ultimately this is for the goal, the expectation, or our goal, or my goal for this project is the certain learning outcomes. And I want the community members, and when I say community in this context, I'm talking about these kids in this school. I want them to learn A, B, C, D. And the reality is that with the way things are going, they're not going to learn that because they were connecting more to them. And so we sat down, we had conversation with the colleague. And so what happened was that we kind of, shifted in our role. And so they ended up becoming the lead facilitator for that day. And I ended up, gauging the room, supporting them. And if there's anything, they come back to me and we had chat and all that. And that experience kind of made me to start really thinking a lot about the impact of my own position in the community where I'm working, my approach to what I'm doing, not just only what I am doing, but really how I'm doing that. And of course, in 2017, I met the person that invited me, and we had an extensive conversation about the project and the discussion conversation when I left and all of that. And he referred to that the process of just switching and shifting that role really added immensely to that project. And so to wrap up my presentation today, because it's a minute, because I want us to have good time for question and answer, is really thinking about what question in ways that the idea of questioning can help us within the context of ethics. Of course, in my own context is socially engaged theater. But the idea of before we even started, during, as we are starting it, as we are working on it, and of course, ultimately, in terms of evaluation, in terms of monitoring and assessing and all that. And of course, all of that, it's another big conversation. That can we bring to the heart of that, thinking about what barriers are we creating? What processes and procedures are we creating? What kind of care are we bringing into the room or are we not bringing? What kind of questions do we need to entertain? Or what kind of where do we need to step back and when do we need to come forward? And so, anyways, that's I will leave my presentation at that, and I will at this point I will stop sharing my screen, and I will open up the space for question and answer. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for sharing and all your insights. We have one question here from Krista. She says, you mentioned taking a pause during the project development. Could you share a bit about the performance phase? Do you have check-ins post-performance or audience check-in?
Thank you so much, Krista. Yes, I do have. And when I'm talking about performance, hopefully I do understand what you're referring to as performance phase. The kind of work that I do is very process driven. So the process of creating and devising with the community is not is part of the project for me, not until we get to the product. So each time we have to check in. We have to check in using thinking. Part of my checklist is really, again, going back to positionality, going back to what the language, going back to the systems in the room that are power that be that are in the room, whether funding or funders and all of that. And then when I have performances, I do have check-ins. Particularly what I try to do with my check-in with performances now, the product now, is that I do what I call like audience card. I ask my audience, I give them card to write their comment about the performance to see, is it useful for them? What kind of question they have? How do they relate to it? I also do a lot of workshops after performance, like where we sort of like sharing our knowledge and sharing the experience and all that. So those are the things that I've kind of built into that process, because ultimately it's all of that that can help me to, in my process of reflection on action, right? Because then after the project is done, I then bring all of that together to say, what does that mean? Okay, there are times that do I need to even follow up with participants who were part of the project? A lot of the time for the audience member, I may not necessarily follow up with them because they might just come and go, right? Because I don't know them. But a lot of the time it's really with the participants. And so to answer your question, Krista, yes, I do that.
Okay. Oh, wow. Got a couple here. Let's go with Justine's question here. It says, thank you. Have you experienced a situation when you and another person wanted the same outcome, but have different ways to get there? Some may consider this infighting. It is so common, even in equity-driven groups. Whose way becomes the lead?
Sorry, could you repeat that question again? I also got it
that chat. It's kind of a couple up there. And it says, have experienced a situation when you and another person wanted the same outcome, but have different ways to get there. Some may consider this infighting. It is common in equity-driven groups. Whose way usually becomes the lead.
Yes, absolutely. Yes, I have, and I continue to. And again, when you're working with community, that's bound to happen. I think for me, what I try to do is to really step back. And when I talk about pause, to take a pause, it's to really take a step back and ask myself, what do they want? What do I want? Because there are times that we actually want the same thing, but we have two things. One, we're seeing it differently. And secondly, the way to get there is different. We have different way of getting there. And so at that point, when I figure that I will come to the table and say, I think this is what we want to do here, is that, ask the other partner, right? We're in partnership. And then from there, okay, if we've clarified that, it's a matter of language. If it's not, if it's totally different, then let's figure it out. But then in terms of how we get there, which is our most of the time the method, my way is not the highway. And I think that's something that it's important that and the fact that I've been doing it this way does not mean that we have to do it that way all the time. Although I have to say that if I realize that the other way is, can be, detrimental to communities, I'll take my stand. I'll back out where I need to back out. And I've had to back out of project because of that. And that's because I realized that it's going to cause harm. But ultimately, if I realize that the way they're going to do it is different from how I'm going to do it, but it's not like it's going to cause any harm. Maybe it's a way for me to learn new things too, right? And see that compromise. So it's really about navigating those through conversation, through dialogue, making mistakes and coming back to make correct ourselves. And again, I always start with myself, because a lot of the time when those hesitations come, it's actually start with me. And then from there, and I think if all partners involved can start with themselves, we can have those things resolved. I do hope that.
I think so. Just making sure we have a few more minutes yet here still. So
That's right.
One more here from Kay. Thank you. Would you have a suggested list of questions to ask ourselves and the people who we work with for the entire process of before, during, and after action? She understands that it may depend on the context.
That's
but
right.
It'd be great to help some starters or reference that we go to when it comes to this kind of questioning.
Yeah, I was expecting this question, and the reason why I didn't put it intentionally was that I don't want to dump things on people. I'm also very mindful of my own positionality. Yes, there are questions that I've developed, and I've published on it. It's out there. I'm happy to send that to the conference organizer, and they can circulate it. And I've kind of divided that on that different categories. And I did mention that it's not in one way, one size. It's not in any way exhaustive, but at least it's a way to get started. So I'm thinking I started from power, privilege, like shifting identities and all that. So yes, there are questions that I've developed that I continue to use myself, and I'm happy to share that. But like I said, I didn't want to just come and then be sharing questions with everybody here, but just to talk through what things that I've been doing myself.
Awesome. What forms of audience care do you recommend are for theater that covers tough topics?
So when we're working on themes that are very charged and very strong themes, I always say, I'm not going to say one size fits all, but I always say consider the first one for me is safety, psychological, emotional. I don't want to re-traumatize, because once there is no safety in the space, once people don't feel safe, we're going to flee. We're not going to engage. So what I try to do is see if I could get counselor into the room, okay? Or I just did a project that was really, it wasn't about performance. It was more about little research, bringing people together about questions, about changing the communities and equity and all that. And I had to create a resource list, legal list, resource list. I had to create emotional, counseling list for, of counselors within the region. I had to create a list of community groups that folks can connect to. So I would say, depending on the project that we are working on, try as much as possible the first one for me is very, very important, is the psychological. Can we get counseling? If there's medical needs, yes. There's also practical needs. Like, prior to COVID, I do any stuff, food has to be in the space. That's really very important for me, because again, if I'm working with, a lot of community members, they are not there because I'm paying them. They are there because I should take that back, the times that I pay them, but it's not compared to, they're not like professional artists. They're doing it out of the fact that they love this topic. And so bringing food to the table even builds community. We exchange. So, and that's practical needs right there. So I always say it's good to really think about all of that in terms of taking care of participants and of course, taking care of the audience. And I've also typed the link to the article I was talking about, and it lists a lot of the questions that I've been using myself in this point.
That's great. So I think we'll flip it over back to Leslie to wrap us up. Thank you so much.
Great, thanks, Ben, and thank you, Taiwo. That was an amazing presentation. I'm sort of lots to think about for that for sure. And thanks to folks who posed some really great questions. So this brings us to the end of the session, unfortunately. I'd like to thank Dr. Afolabi for sharing his insights and knowledge with us, and for the many participants we had. We were over 100, I think, for the presentation. This is the final session for day 1 of the conference, and we hope you're able to participate again tomorrow, as there's an amazing lineup of sessions. In the morning, starting at 9 a.m., there's a session on restoring humanity in the classroom. Then there's one that I'm definitely going to tune in for, one on Indigenous professional communication, with a great lineup of speakers for that one. And then the last session of the morning is one on Western media coverage of the recent protests in Iran, which sounds fascinating. Tomorrow afternoon, starting at 1, there are 2 final sessions. The first is on narratives of our lives and humanity during the current challenging global period that we're living in. And lastly, a session on and with ChatGPT, which is a topic that seems ubiquitous of late. I had a host guest a month ago, and that was all he was talking about. He must have shares, I think. So as I said, tomorrow's session begins at 9 a.m. And we hope you can join again tomorrow. And if you're registered as a participant, a reminder that we'll be sending out a recording of all of the sessions, including ones that you were maybe not able to tune in to, with many different obligations. So once again, a thank you to our presenter and to my lovely co-moderator, Ben, and fellow MAPC soon-to-be grad. And I hope all of you have a great afternoon. Yeah, and that is the close of our day.